This is my 40-gallon aquarium and it's currently 147 days old, so I wanted to publish this video going over its setup as well as how things have been going. So starting with the initial setup, and around 5 months ago I added some Fluval Stratum to the tank to act as its substrate. Then I toyed around with a few different spiderwood placements to try and come up with something that I liked. I glued the spiderwood to some lava rock and then left the glue to dry and cure fully overnight before I added it to the tank. Lava rock is cheap because it's so lightweight, so it can end up floating even with hardscape glued onto it, so try and sink it in a bucket of water before you attach your hardscape. I purchased this Fluval FX2 canister filter in a sale in a local shop to save money for a larger tank build that I want to do next year, but I decided to use it on this 40-gallon tank. I chose to do a fishless and plantless cycle with this tank that took just over a month, and as you can see the tank was covered in algae by the end of it. Dr. Tim's Ammonia Solution was used to simulate fish waste and cycle the tank, but I wanted the bacteria and Archaea to do the heavy lifting without any help from plants. My water parameter test kits were shown that the tank could take a dose of 2 ppm of ammonia and process it down to 0 ppm ammonia and 0 ppm nitrite within 24 hours after around 5 weeks, so I decided to clean the tank and add plants. I used some cheap kitchen scourer pads to clean the tank glass, and then I used a siphon to try and suck out as much of the brown diatom algae as possible. Some of the brown diatom algae was a pain to remove, so I decided to leave it in place as my snails and shrimp will eat it anyway. I'm not 100% sure what this was on the actual substrate after the tank cycled, but I left it in there anyway, and thankfully my shrimp ended up eating most of it. So I started the planting process with an Echinodorus Rennie plant, and I chose this because I really like the colour, and unlike many other Echinodorus plants, this one does stay pretty small. Then I added a couple of Echinodorus Cordifolius fluitans to the back right of the tank, as I knew I wanted a tall sword plant there, but I didn't want something so gigantic like an Echinodorus Blairi. In the end I ended up moving those plants to the back left of the tank further down the line, but I can't remember when I did that. After that I added 2 Echinodorus aquatica plants to the left hand side of the hardscape because these are my favourite sword plants. They stay really small and I like the lime green colour that they have, but one of them unfortunately melted and failed. I'm pretty sure that the other plant being added to the background is an Echinodorus ocelot, but it also melted and failed within a couple of weeks. Next up I added 2 Java ferns to the hardscape island on the right hand side of the tank. My initial plan for this tank was to have the taller plants on the right hand side and then have a triangle composition towards the left hand side where shorter plants would live. Then I added an Anubias petite to the right hand island just under the Java fern to try and fill that island out a little. My Busa philandra kedagang has been kept in a few different locations in this tank, but initially I kept it near the Anubias petite. Next I added Anubias coinleaf, Anubias nana, Anubias glabra and Anubias coffeefolia to the middle island in the tank in the hope that it would grow out, and I'm actually really happy with how this particular island is grown out as the months go by. I wanted to try and carpet this tank, and I saw a lot of people recommending Henolanthium telanum green, so I decided to give it a try. I can't actually remember how many pots of the plant that I used for this tank, but this step took about 30 minutes and by the end of it I was definitely regretting choosing it for such a large tank. I wouldn't actually mind trying this again in a smaller tank where I won't need as many pots or as much time to plant it, because it did go kind of well, but it just takes so long to plant it. I had plenty of Hygrophila polysperma in my 29-gallon tank, so I decided to take a couple of clippings from that to use in this 40-gallon setup. I have a love-hate relationship with Hygrophila polysperma, but I did decide to try it and I added it to the back right near the Echinodorus cordifolian fluitans to help add some volume. Then I took some Rotala rotundifolia clippings from my 29-gallon tank and moved them over to my 40-gallon. I placed this initial batch of Rotala towards the left hand side of the tank with the idea of trimming it to keep its slow growth on the gradual decline for the triangle composition. I added some root tabs under the various types of Echinodorus in the tank, but I'm honestly not sure this added any benefit at all. This is my Echinodorus aquatica in my 12-gallon tank, and this is the one in my 29-gallon tank, and both of them are doing considerably better than the one in my 40-gallon tank, and they don't have root tabs at all. Anyway, getting back to the build, I moved some Salvinia from my 12-gallon tank over to my 40-gallon tank, as I do like to have a little surface cover in my tanks. This is what the tank looked like at this stage, but I decided that I did want to add a couple more stem plants to the setup. I ended up grabbing some more Rotala rotundifolia and a little Ludwigia mini super red from my 8-gallon betta fish tank. The Rotala clippings were added to the clump on the left hand side that I added earlier, and I placed the Ludwigia mini super red behind the middle island to add a splash of red colour just in the centre of the tank. I moved the pothos back from my 29-gallon tank over to my 40-gallon tank, as I did like the idea of having emergent plants in my aquariums, but I have since moved away from this. My main reason for this was that the pothos is just so efficient at dealing with nitrates in my aquarium that my aquatic plants ended up having nutritional issues. At this stage, I left the tank to age in for a couple of weeks because brand new plants can be high in copper, and this can cause problems for shrimp. Once I was happy, I decided to order some shrimp online, and I was really excited to get my shrimp as this was my first time trying orange neocaridines. My friend also needed some Armano shrimp, so we decided to do a joint order to keep the shipping costs low, and he took half of these Armanos for his tank. These are the orange neocaridina shrimp that I picked up, and all of these are mine, so they'll be staying in this aquarium. I floated both bags in my aquarium to temperature acclimate the shrimp because all of the Armanos would be staying in this tank until the following weekend when my friend could pick his up. Just before adding the shrimp to the tank, I had a change of heart and decided to use the pipette method to gradually get the shrimp used to the water parameters of the tank, making the temperature acclimation process pretty pointless. This does usually take a long time because I try and add a couple of drops every 15 to 20 minutes and then leave them in that water overnight, but once I was happy, I netted the Armanos and added them to the tank. These little guys seemed really keen to get to work and started feeding on whatever that stuff is that's grown on the substrate. Some of the Armano shrimp spread out and went on their own little adventures looking for food, but there was a small little group that initially stuck to the left hand corner. It didn't take long for the Armano shrimp to spread out, and they started to graze on pretty much every surface that they could find. Then I netted the orange neocaridina shrimp and added them into the tank. The orange neos did the same as the Armano shrimp, and they quickly started grazing on the various surfaces in the tank. I'm guessing that the stuff grown on the substrate is some type of algae, but all of these shrimp seem to really enjoy eating it. Just in case anyone's wondering, I keep Armano shrimp and neocaridina shrimp together in most of my aquariums, and I never have issues with aggression. The Armano shrimp do bully the smaller neos away from food from time to time, but my neos just swim off and find something else to eat. I decided to move one of the horned neurite snails from my 29-gallon tank over to the 40-gallon tank to try and get it to help with the algae cleanup. My fish came the following day, and I picked up 3 pearl gourami, 15 harlequin rasboras and 15 cardinal tetras. I floated all 3 bags in the tank to temperature acclimate them, and then I netted the fish up and added them to the tank one species at a time. The 3 pearl gourami went in first, and they seemed really happy to be in their new home. Next were the cardinal tetras, who had minimal colour on them when I added them to the tank because of the stress of the shipping process. Thankfully they didn't hide away, and they started to shoal around the tank pretty much as soon as I added them, and this does seem to be a normal behaviour for tetras in a new tank. Finally, I added the harlequin rasboras to the tank, and these guys seem to hold their colour really well during the shipping process. Still, they did seem to be a little freaked out and decided to shoal around their new home for a while. Here's some footage of the tank at this stage, and the fish had probably been in there for a couple of minutes. You can see that the cardinals and harlequins are sticking to their species specific shoals, while the pearl gourami are chilling out under the floating plants in the tank. Gourami aren't a shoaling fish, but they are definitely a social fish, and my honeys and pearls do this thing where they'll follow each other around and then they'll randomly start playing, but at other times they want to be independent and just go off and do their own thing. I noticed that this little guy was a totally different colour to the rest of the Harlequin rasboras, and I initially thought he may be a lamb chop rasbora or maybe a glowlight rasbora that had been added by mistake. There's also this little guy too, and I have no idea what's actually going on here, but I would suspect it's some type of deformed Harlequin rasbora. Unfortunately, one of the female pearl gourami refused to eat any type of food that I tried with her, and I ended up losing her within days. I also ended up losing the deformed Harlequin rasbora as well as 2 other Harlequins and 1 cardinal tetra within the first week, but since then all the original fish made it through. This is my first time keeping Harlequin rasboras, and I did get a few little scares from this if you look closely, because the lips on the fish end up turning white and it caused me to think that they may have mouth fungus. After doing some research, there seems to be mixed opinions on the cause of this, with some people saying it's just light reflection off the lips of the fish and other people saying it's a sign of stress. About a week later, I realised that I hadn't seen any of the orange neocaridina for a while. Then I saw these 3 coming out from under this rock. I'm not sure why so many of the orange neocaridina were hiding at this stage, but a lot of them would just stay under the lava rock. Some of them were brave and they'd happily roam around the tank, and I never once saw any of the fish in here be aggressive towards them. Unfortunately, this orange neocaridina colony ended up failing, and I only have 2 of the original 12 left, and I've consistently had issues with orange neocaridina. I'm not 100% sure when I actually did this, so some of the plants may flip around in the video clips, but the random directions of the growth of Hygrophila polyspermina started to annoy me. Rotala rotundifolia has a consistent vertical growth pattern, making it easy to understand what the plant's going to do, so I decided to remove the Hygrophila. I went back to my betta fish tank and took more Rotala trimmings and decided to plant them where the Hygrophila used to be, in the back right corner. Not long after this, I noticed that both blackbeard algae and staghorn algae were starting to form on various surfaces in the aquarium, so I decided to add some horned neurite snails to try and help with it, but in all honesty, I really don't think they help. It didn't take long for both of these algae types to spread, and within weeks they were covering most of the surfaces in the tank, and it was really starting to annoy me. After around another week, the Henolanthium telenum green was also covered in these algae types, so I decided to take action. I kept looking for potential causes of this algae outbreak, but I couldn't find any issues, and it was starting to drive me crazy. I decided to try manually removing as much of the algae as I could, and I pulled all of this out within around 10 minutes, and it just didn't seem to make a dent in it. Then, when doing some research, I found a random Reddit post from someone with a very similar tank setup to me, and a lot of the comments were recommending heat tests for phosphate. At the time, I didn't actually have a phosphate test kit, so I picked one up and my phosphate levels were very high. I decided to get myself a tap-powered water change system so I could quickly and easily do large partial water changes to try and lower the phosphate levels. I also picked up a Siamese algae eater to try and help with the algae build-up, but I thought he was so cute when I first got him because he was absolutely tiny, and I honestly thought he was a total waste of time because of his small size and didn't think he'd be able to do anything. Initially, he seemed to really enjoy exploring his new home and looking for food, but for the first few days I'd only ever see him swimming around and looking for any food that was left over from his tank mates. Then a switch seemed to have flipped in his brain and he realised that the algae was edible, and pretty much every time I walked by the tank he was picking at whatever he could find. From what I can tell, Henolanthium telenum green can have a melt stage similar to crypts, and it dumped a lot of phosphate into the water, potentially causing this algae to form. My male pearl gourami ended up making his first bubble nest around the time I was finally getting the algae under control, but nothing came of this one, but he wasn't going to give up. He kept making bubble nests for months and months and months without the female pearl gourami paying him any attention, but his persistence did eventually pay off. Finally, I had the blackbeard and staghorn algae under control, so I decided to get myself a lotus lily for the tank and rested the bulb on the substrate in the back behind the middle island. I don't remember when I did this, but I also added 5 albino corydoras and some of my neon tetras to the tank. Both species settled into the tank within hours and I haven't had any trouble from them with aggression or anything like that. My pearl gourami ended up having babies around 6 weeks ago, and when these guys have babies, they really have babies. I tried counting them multiple times, but I kept losing count because they'd randomly dart around, but I would guess that there was around 200 fry in there, and unfortunately they all seem to have been eaten by their tank mates. The pearl gourami kept making bubble nests and trying to keep their tank mates away from the nest, so in the end I ended up giving both pearl gourami to one of my friends with a dedicated pearl gourami tank. So that brings me up to current day, and I recently added my 2 honey gourami to the tank and they have made themselves at home and settled in without issue. I've also been using this tank as a place to keep any rejected cherry shrimp from my breeding tanks so they can live out the rest of their life away from the breeding projects. All of the plants in here seem to be doing well, but I do want to keep this Rotala rotundifolia around its current level and have the lotus lily as a more obvious feature in the tank. My corydoras and harlequin rasboras have both been spawning recently, and their high activity levels do seem to have scared my tetras and honey gourami. Both species seem to have just hid in the plants for the last week or two, but they are slowly starting to come back out as my cories seem to have calmed down. My Siamese algae eater is growing at a rapid pace, and this little guy never stops eating. He's definitely one of my favourite fish to watch as he does some random stuff and he's very active, but it's fun to watch him hunting for food. He's such an active fish that I enjoy watching, and so far he hasn't displayed any aggression to his tank mates, but I am keeping a close eye on him. This filter has done an excellent job with this tank and it hasn't had any issues with ammonia or nitrite since I initially cycled it months ago. I'm currently running this tank on one Hyger 957 and one Nicru C10 light with a photo period of 8 hours, and all the plants seem to be growing well. Other than some green algae forming on the tank glass every now and then, I haven't had any serious issues with algae recently. That said, the phosphate levels in this tank are still far higher than in any of my other aquariums, and I honestly don't know why. There is a gravel vacuum attachment for my water change system, so I gravel vac the substrate a couple of weeks ago to try and remove detritus and fish waste. My corydoras were living the dream when I did this because there was a ton of detritus worms swimming around in the water column and that's their favourite food, but in all honesty it just didn't do anything. The phosphate levels are still higher than my other tanks, but thankfully they're nowhere near as high as they were a couple of months back, so I'm hoping it stays like this and the algae stays away. I am thinking of moving my chili rasboras over to this tank in a couple of weeks so I can rescape my 12-gallon tank, but I'm not sure if I'll keep them in the 40-gallon or move them back to the 12-gallon after the rescape. Other than that, I only really plan to add any rejected shrimp from my breeding tanks to this setup, and I'm honestly really happy with how things are going. I will keep everyone posted with monthly updates on this tank as well as all of my other aquariums in my monthly fish room videos, but that brings the video to an end. Hopefully you'll be able to avoid some of the mistakes I made with this tank with your own setups. Thanks for watching and have a good day.